you can just replace one word in my text and it still makes sense. So, clever trick, will it work? First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to tell you something about my recent activities. And in a way, I think it's an honor to see that a book like Supermodernism is still existing somehow, because I feel, because I'm writing about contemporary things mainly, it feels to me that quite often they are just provisional statements, a kind of provisional interpretations of what's going on, which are not necessarily valid for a very long time. So it's in a way sometimes also a bit of an embarrassment to see that things I've been doing in the past are still, let's say, held against me in some way. Last year, I made this little book, which is now part of my current activities as a publisher. The book is cheap, it's only €18, I say this because I'm a publisher and I need to get some income out of it. I have only one copy here, so you cannot buy it from me, but you can order it on my website and get it within a few days in your home. It's called Shifts Architecture After the 20th Century. And it's the catalogue of an exhibition which I made together with the Powerhouse Company, the Dutch-Danish architectural office. And it is about the crisis. The exhibition is showing models of economic situations, you could say. So it's not architectural, they look like architectural models made with wood and copper, and they're made as architectural models, but they are not. This one, for instance, shows the depth and the depth of the Western world compared to the vast amount of money which is available in China. Landscape showing this different situation. And this is another model which I think is really interesting. It shows the chronological sequence of economic crisis and depressions. And this one here is 1929, the big moment in Western history. And the one on top, the really big one, is 2008. So you see the difference in scale. And also, this is, I think, 250 years, how the crashes are accumulating in the last century, which certainly has to do with globalization. And here is another one. This is mobile, showing the leverage of banks before the crisis, which means that if you were having this, you were able to get a loan from the bank for this. So there's enormous difference in, let's say, existing capital and available capital was part of this model. I think it's not a coincidence that I started this project in the Netherlands together with the Powerhouse Company, because the Netherlands is one of the countries which has been hit severely by the crisis in 2008. Just to give you an idea, between 2008, especially the architecture world, between 2008 and today, about 60% of all the people working in architectural offices lost their job. So it went down from 15,000 to 6, which is really a dramatic movement. And it has to do with the fact that the Dutch economy was really dependent on architecture, the building industry, as a kind of motor for development. And this, of course, you all speak Dutch. This is the prices of property, houses, and the net income. And the prices of the houses are in red, and the income development is in black. And here you see the moment where it goes wrong. That This was the crisis of the 1970s, which started with this peak and then this low point. But from here, you can see that for many people, having property was a better way of generating income than having a job. And this gap between the value of property and the rise of income is, let's say, one of the fundamentals for the crisis. The whole story I'm going to tell you is maybe a bit deterministic, but I'm subjecting myself to this thing, determinism as well. Here you see the changing percentage of the GDP in the Netherlands between 1970 and 2015, which means that everything which is above the zero line means that those are years of growth, and everything below it are years of depression and recession. And if you look at my career, I started working at the Netherlands Architecture Institute after graduation, which was in 1990, more or less, and I studied in the 1980s. So I studied here when the economy was fine. I started to work at the ME when the economy was fine, and I left the moment when there was hardly any growth. Then I started my magazine, and you see the same development, or you can see that I was able to benefit very much from this long period of economic growth, which generated lots of architecture, which enabled me to write about all this interesting Dutch architecture and use this wave of popularity of Dutch architecture to move to a situation which led to the invitation here at university. Because I'm pretty sure if I was not living in the Netherlands in this time, but in another country, it would have been much harder for me to gain any reputation, just as it would have been really difficult for me if I was living, let's say, if I was born 10 years earlier or 10 years later. So I'm extremely lucky that I was having this situation. Same is true with the magazine, which I started together with graphic designer Arjan Groot in 2004, where you can see in between 2002 and 2006 there was a stable period, and we sold the magazine here because of financial problems, of course. So I was just out of the magazine business in time to escape the worst part of the crisis. So again, a very deterministic thing. And then I started to publish books like these, which are really small scale, low budget, hardly any risk for me. So in this time of crisis, I feel I'm pretty much safe. There are many reasons why I started publishing books, but I'm not going to talk about it. And in 2012, shortly after the publication of this, I left Europe because my wife got a job in Canada, so I could follow her. Which was also, for me, kind of escape from the crisis, because Canada and Australia were about the only Western countries which managed to escape the crisis in the last years. And this is the slogan of Calgary. I'm not living there, but it's just showing you onward. There's still this kind of positive, future, forward-looking orientation, which makes it quite nice. But then I'm living in Montreal. This is a poster for elections, which shows the actual situation in the city of Montreal, which was very successful in the 1960s when they were having this big expo, World Expo, which was extremely successful. It was a very liberal country with Trudeau as the Prime Minister, but here it starts to crumble. There's a crisis here, and the city itself is more or less in decline. Population is leaving Montreal itself. Canada is still growing, but it's certainly not as good as it was. And if you look now in Canadian newspapers, you see news like this, that there's concern about, let's say, the sustainability of the economy. There's the same issue as in the Netherlands and many other European countries, that housing prices, mortgages, which are too high, are affecting the economy. And if you look closer, it seems like a very safe place, but it's maybe not. Canada has now, that's something else, but that's also quite interesting, 0.2 architects per 1,000 inhabitants. And here you see some other comparisons with Italy, leading the world with 2.1 per 1,000. And there's an average in the developed world of 3/4 of an architect per 1,000, which means that potentially there's a market in Canada for 20,000 architects, which is more than double what they have. If, 3 times what they have. If Canada would have the average of the developed world. Interesting as well, China, you see it's almost, it would be the equivalent of 82 architects in all of Canada. Just to give you an idea. And then the question is, of course, is this showing a potential, or is this showing a kind of balance between supply and demand? I'm not really sure. You could say that there are maybe too many architects. I would dare to make this statement. To give you an idea, yesterday I was in Milan. I was having dinner in a wine bar, and I was starting a conversation with the owner, and the wine bar was looking nice, by the way. The owner said, "What are you doing?" And I was told that I'm writing about architecture. And they said, "Okay, why you're in Milan?" So I explained that I was writing about an architect who did something in this city life area. And then he said, "But that's Hadid and this kid. Who is he then?" And then I understood that he was an expert, and it turned out he was not only an expert but also an ex-architect. So he became this owner of the wine. I think in Canada, if you look around, there might be balance. So the supply and demand is more or less. I don't know about China, which is developing in such a rapid pace that it will change, probably also with this ratio of architects per inhabitants. But in a way, it's telling something. Because if you look at this Europe and Japan, if you look at architectural magazines, there is a lot of publications about Europe and about Japan. And it seems to me that the role of architecture might be different there compared to the rest of the world. I don't know, because you can say that there are different significances of architecture there. And because of this long period of cultural dominance of Europe, there is this, let's say, fixed belief that the European definition of architecture, which has been dominating for a long time, is seen as a kind of model for the rest of the world. It was the model for the rest of the world as long as Europe was colonizing the rest of the world. But nowadays, I think you could question if that's true. I will return to that later on. If you look at the future, global trends, this is a report made by the National Intelligence Council, which is a kind of public version of the CIA, you could say, in the US. And they are describing the situation, which is also, let's say, very relevant for architecture. Owing to the rapid urbanization in the developing world, the volume of urban construction over the next 40 years would roughly equal the entire volume of such construction today in world history. So, let's say, how old are the oldest buildings we have? Let's say 2,000 years to simplify. So, what's been built in 2,000 years is going to be built in the next 40 years. It's just inconceivable what that means. Right now, the urban population is just above this 50%. You all know this famous figure, which came out at the beginning of the century. And in 2030, it will be 60%. So that means an increase of the urban population from 3.5 million to 4.9 billion. And this, China, could be a kind of example of this rapid urbanization. And I very much like this image because it's so rich in its variety and this kind of collision of everything. But you could ask the question, To which extent this is related to this definition of architecture as we know it in Europe. They're interesting and fascinating buildings, but it's not necessarily the same. I'm going to leave these out. This may be too small for you to read, so I will read it for you. In this report on future of the world scenarios, which is written by the National Intelligence Agency, there's this introduction referring to Dickens' famous Tale of Two Cities, describing that the backdrop for the Tale of Two Cities was the French Revolution and the dawn of the Industrial Age. And we are living through a similar transformative period in which the brief and scope of possible development, both good and bad, are equal to, if not greater, than the aftermath of the political economical revolution of the 18th century. And below that there is a quote of Dickens. First of all, I think it's a very Western-centric approach to think that the French Revolution and its effect on the Western world are similar to what the whole world is experiencing now. But I think it's interesting that it suggests that we are witnessing another revolutionary period, which is also clear. There's the global trends overview of this report, where you see many different things, of which I think the change of demographic patterns, and then I'm returning to this deterministic approach, is one of the most important things. It says that economic growth might decline in Asian countries. They still keep growing, it might decline, but I think if you see what's happening right now, then it's quite obvious that it is in some ways already declining. Here you see the median age of countries in 2010 and 20 years later. And the lighter it is, the older it is, and blue is the oldest. And here you see Japan and Europe, the two areas with the highest number of architects. And I'm not saying that there is, let's say, 100% correlation between the two, but there is a relation between the fact that there is an aging population in countries where there is so much architecture. Here you see the median age in some parts of the world. Again, 2010, 2030, and this is an important one, what they call the demographic window of opportunity, which is the period in which the society is benefiting from what they call this demographic dividend. If the next generation is bigger than the previous one, everyone will benefit from that, because that's, let's say, the first basis for economic growth. And here you see, again, the same image, where the red one is areas where the window is closed. Japan, obviously, but also most European countries, which had their best time before the turn of the century. In the US, the window is closing, and Brazil, India, China, it's wide open, which reflects a shift in the global order. And last week I gave this lecture in Halifax, in Canada, so that's why there are some statistics about Canada, which is not included in this window of opportunity, but it's more or less the same story. This is from 2006. Here you see the moment of start of stagnation, where the start of what they call negative natural increase, which means the population is declining. Here you see something similar, where they try to compensate it with immigrants, which is this lighter part, but then again you see that there is, even in this positive projection, it's going down. And this is happening everywhere, which leads to a situation where the middle class income is shifting from the west to the east. Here you see that in light blue and dark blue is Europe and the United States. The shares of global middle class consumption. It's big, and then on the other side, it goes to 2050. You see that the red and yellowish is Asia, India, China, and the rest. Which means that there is the shift in consumption over the next 40 years from the west to the east, and on an enormous scale. And this all leads to a growing irrelevance, you could say, or less importance of the West when it comes to global power. And here you see how the developed countries are going down here, and the countries which are considered as not being included in the OECD are increasing. And this is a kind of total opposite development. Right now, many Western countries are punching above their weight. They are much more important than they should be based on their green power. And again, this is the same story. You can see that China and India are the big underachievers until now, and the US and Western Europe are the big overachievers, including Canada. When I was writing this book, it's a sequel to an exhibition which I made in 2009, 1 year after, 2 years after the crisis really set in. And this is a kind of reassessment of what we've been doing in this previous exhibition. And while preparing it, I was reading this article, Crossing a Watershed Unawares, in the New York Times, written by Paul Kennedy, which I think is a very interesting article, although it begins with something which I consider as an editor as totally wrong beginning of an article. You should never begin an article by saying that according to a dictionary, the word you're using means something, because that's just the word cliché you could do. But the article itself is extremely interesting, because what he's saying is that without fully realizing it, because everyone is more interested in having the latest iPhone than think about changing the world, this works. Without realizing it, there is a big shift happening in the Western world, which is an end of the power which goes back maybe to the moment that Columbus discovered America and Europe started to colonize a big part of the world. So this is the kind of longest period you could define when it comes to shifts that the dominant role of Europe from, let's say, 1500 until 2000. He describes this very much based on current developments, changes which he notices, which are extremely important for this, let's say, balance of power. One of them is the decreasing role of the dollar as the reserve currency. So, until very recently, nearly everything was using the dollar as a kind of backbone for trade. And now you can see that it's going down from, let's say, 85%, I think, to something like 65% today, and it's decreasing even further. The second thing Paul Kennedy sees as a change is the diminishing role of the United Nations, and especially diminishing role of the Security Council, kind of incapacity of intervening in crucial moments. The third one is obviously the crisis in Europe, which has Greece as a symbol, but during the last few weeks I've seen more than one article pointing at Italy as one of the, let's say, biggest dangers for the future of the euro. But the crisis in Europe and the incapacity of European leaders to really solve it, and it's something that is extremely clear in the Netherlands as well. It's the third issue. And the fourth one is the rise, especially in military power of the East. This whole geopolitical shift to the East is something which is, for instance, visible, according to me, in the large budget for increasing the military power. And he says that this is creating an end to the Western dominance. And I think I have two images which are also published in the book, which are quite telling. This is a G8 in L'Aquila, where for a long time I thought that Berlusconi was just talking to everyone, but no one in particular, until I moved to Canada and realized that this grey-haired man is nobody else than the very conservative Prime Minister Harper of Canada. So they were having this conversation. But I think the setting of this whole, this looks like businessman on holiday or something like that, or after a day of conferencing, having a glass of white wine and just being there on the terrace. And compare that to this. This is the final meeting, final session of the BRICS summit in New Delhi in 2012. And I think for anyone in the Western world, you should see the symbolic significance of this image, waving goodbye. So, of course, you can look at it from different ways. This is an issue of time which you could also reverse. Yes, America is in decline. No, it isn't. But for me, there are many indications that things are changing. So in the long run, there is this 500 years of political, military, and economic power of the West. And if you look at a smaller perspective, you could say that it's the birth rate. If you look at Europe, before 1800 there was a relatively stable population which was growing just a little bit, with less than 1% per year, from let's say 1500 to 1800. Of course, wars and diseases created a kind of decline every now and then, but there was this more or less stable population until 1800, then it went up like that. And this has come to an end. Here you see the projection of expected population growth between now and 2020 or 2025. I forgot what was the final date, but the message is clear. Light blue is shrinking, dark blue is still growing. So Turkey and Ireland and Luxembourg are still growing significantly. France a bit, but here you see, including Germany and Italy, whole Central and Eastern Europe is shrinking. And I think you could say that there is a very simple rule of thumb. Architecture is there because people need to be accommodated. There's space for dwelling, for offices, etc. And if there are less people, there will be less need for architecture. So this is, let's say, a small window. An even smaller window is postmodernism. For a long time, and it's also in my book on supermodernism, I had the idea that, as a style at least, postmodernism was something of a very ephemeral character, which only lasted for a very short time. But more and more I started to realize that postmodernism as a way of thinking, as a mindset, is much more influential. And to quote in a very postmodern way a scientific source, this is an article in the Vanity Fair by Kurt Anderson, which describes a very interesting situation, which might be for me the essence of this postmodern mentality. So I'm saying on the devolution. What he's describing is that even though new technology is coming to us in an ever more rapid speed, here you see how long it took the American population, before 25% of the American population had started to use certain inventions. You see, electricity took 46 years, and the World Wide Web only 7. So this is showing the speed of changes in the use of technology. But what Kurt Anderson is saying is that even though new technology is certainly totally different compared to 10, 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, the rest of the world is not changing that fast. Because if you look at other developments, he said, it's showing a kind of stagnation. And this stagnation is something which I believe is very typical of this post-era. Here you see 3 quarters, let's say 1950s, 70s, 90s. You can see the same red color. And this is a car with hardly any development, you could say, in its model. But still, you can see there's a substantial difference in the cars. If you look at fashion, that's one of the examples that Kurt Anderson uses. You can say the difference between 1950 and 1970. It's clear. Nobody would make a mistake to say that this is 1970s and this is 1950s. Same is true if you look at 1970s and 1990s. Again, a very clear difference. But then, if you look at the difference between 1990 and 2010, it's, of course, I edited these images to find something which is nice to compare, but it's quite typical. If you look at pictures of yourself or your parents in 1990, you're not totally embarrassed. If you would see your parents in the 1970s, it might be slightly more difficult to appreciate. And here you see something similar, the same dress which reappeared 1990s, 2010s, or to give you another example which is also used in terms of music, there is also Lady Gaga, Madonna is maybe less of a difference than Madonna and Phil Collins in the 1970s, something like that. Not only the few. Already in 1989, Francis Fukuyama wrote this famous book, The End of History and the Last Man, in which he described that with the disappearance of the Iron Curtain in Europe and the collapse of the Soviet Union, a new period in time came into being, which he described as the end of history. Of course, he said it's not really the end of history, because history will evolve, but history as we've known it will end somewhere here. And this is quite close to what's also written in this book review. I just found it when I was reading the review by the Canadian artist and writer Douglas Cutman, who reviewed this highly Kunstboek book in the New York Times. And he was saying that in his review, he described the beginning of the 21st century as the beginning of, I'm quoting, an aura-free universe in which all eras coexist at once, a state of possibly permanent atemporality, given to us courtesy of the internet. No particular era now dominates. We live in a post-era without forms of its own, powerful enough to brand the times. The zeitgeist of 2012 is that we have a lot of zeit but not much geist. I can't believe I just wrote the last sentence, but it's true. And this is also quite similar to what is written in this very nice book by Alessandro Barrico, Barbari, which is, by coincidence, only translated in Dutch as far as I know. I couldn't find any other translation, in which, and I'm quoting it in the translation in English, that he describes that for the barbarians, which we all are, we find ourselves, or soon will be, that the past is arranged in a single, let me see. The past is arranged in a single trajectory that can be defined as that which no longer exists. So there's no kind of chronological sequence, but everything which is the past is just behind us. Whereas for civilization, the repeated measuring of the distance from the past is at the very heart of the matter. For the barbarians, for us, the distance is always the same. The Greek column, the monocle, the cold, and the medieval relic all occupy the same trajectory and are all bound up on the same dumping ground. In a way, they're also immediately accessible. There's no need to delve deep. You just stick your hand out and there they are. This idea that history has no depth is something which is extremely postmodern. And if you look at postmodern architecture, the way they had all those quotations and used references to things in the past, it was just like this way of sticking your hand out and you've got it. And this notion that we entered a new era in which the past is just something behind is of course very much stimulated by the internet, which also has no past. Everything is past post on a blog, but it's just one thing and you can access it immediately. This idea of distance in time is absent, and this is creating the postmodernism is doing postmodernism. I like this thing very much. Or you could even extend it to a definition of post everything. Because in a way, we are in Europe at least post-growth, post-cultural, post-political, post-economical, etc. So we are in a totally new situation. And this is from the US, but it's also, I think, relevant for many other countries, including Italy, that over the past years, it turns out that having a higher education is not very helpful in getting a career. You see that the number of graduated students with a PhD working as a waiter is increasing. It's just like my Italian restaurant yesterday, an architect working in a restaurant, owning a restaurant, is part of this problem. So there's part of this, you could say, as long as the population is growing and increasingly wealthy, there is this demographic dividend, but at some point it's changing. And now, of course, we can blame the baby boomers, and the architects of powerhouse company are quite strict in this and severe in this. It's part of the baby boom crisis. Baby boomers are occupying, let's say, the biggest chunk of wealth in the Western world, and the same social mobility which was possible for that generation is absent for the current generation. And this is something which is not included in this book shift, but it's according to me extremely relevant, and more I see the relevance of this, and this is social inequality, which is of course extreme in the US, where 1% on more than 1/3 of the whole country. This image, and it's related to architecture as well. This is again data from the US, where you see the top incomes over a period of time from 1913 until 2008. And interestingly, here you see this was the beginning of the crisis, when there was this huge income, and also the suggestion of huge income inequality of the richest layer of society. And here, around 1928, when there was this previous crisis of the Depression, it was similar. And in between, there is a period of, let's say, relatively low growth of this high income. And I think it's no coincidence that you see where it starts to increase is here, the black one, with the top one income. It starts here, which is, I'm not saying that there's a correlation, but it's a moment that this book was published, The Language of Postmodern Architecture. And it's the starting of postmodernism, the start of the Reagan years, starting with Thatcher in the UK, when the world was starting to change. Here you see something else about this inequality. Again, based on the US, here you see 10% of the highest incomes have 210% of the average, while the 10% of the lowest only have less than 40%. And on top, you see countries like Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, Belgium, etc., who are much more, let's say, equal. And I don't think it's purely a coincidence that those countries have more public architecture nowadays than others like US and Canada. Here you see another version of the same income inequality, where again you see Scandinavia as the most equal countries, and here Italy, UK, US. I read something a while ago in The Economist that part of this income inequality is this total lack of social mobility in countries like the UK, the US, and Italy. It's much more likely that if you are a lawyer or an architect, it's not unlikely that your father or mother is a lawyer or an architect. In the UK, and US, and Italy. There is this kind of constant reaffirmation of, even to the level of the profession, of this income inequality. Well, there's another one where again you see the difference between the green triangle and the red spot is the difference between high and low, the richest and the poorest. And you see the UK being much more extreme than Italy here. But again, the countries which are really close are on that side. I think this leads to, that's another issue which I think is extremely important right now. We hear a lot about the erosion of the middle class, that the middle class is just getting poorer and poorer everywhere. It's a discussion which is recurring in North America constantly and many European countries as well. The rich are getting richer, the middle class is just eaten out, because the division in the economy is now that there are, let's say, low-paid jobs on the one hand, high-paid, high earners on the other hand, and this average middle-class job is more or less replaced, it's outsourced, or it's just vanishing. And this ends this relatively short period of relative coherence in the Western world, which is expressed by this beautiful picture of Paris around 1900. And I think this has been extremely important for the development of European architecture and European cities. This kind of middle-class culture, this bourgeois culture, this was the very core of its architecture. And architects are, to a large extent, also the product of this middle class. And I'm just showing some images. This is Romania in the 1930s. Where you can see this. And this period of 1800 until 2000 is when you can see here European countries like Britain, France, Germany, and Italy having this big increase in income for the average inhabitants. And this has led to this creation of this middle class, which is, I think, unique for Europe because of the scale and the coherence it had. Of course, this was a time when Europe was still dominating the world, and this has led to this situation where we came to believe that the European definition of architecture was very much the center of the architectural definition for the whole universe. This increase of income started in the 17th century with the agrarian revolution. Because before the 17th century, you needed 8 people to work on the land to sustain 10, which meant that if your parents were living long enough, they were the only ones who were allowed to stay at home. But the rest of the family had to work to feed themselves and the grandparents. After this mechanization of agriculture, there was a kind of surplus of people who could develop other jobs, could work in another way than just sustaining themselves. And this was kind of starting point, the basis for what could become the Industrial Revolution. Another ingredient was, of course, the scientific revolution. And here we see the invention of the steam machine, which was just something which you could do at home, of course. Invent the steam machine. And this was the other ingredient which led to this industrial revolution. So there was this power to industrialize, and there was the workforce to industrialize. And with this was also the French Revolution. This is maybe not the nicest image of the French Revolution, because this is kind of the revenge taken. But of course, it changed the structure of Western society. This revolution led to democratization, after a while, to the introduction of new values within society, and it created its basis for its middle class. And there is, according to me, a direct relation between this pattern of industrialization and urbanization and also to architecture. Because if you look at this map, this is Europe in 1850, so 50 years after the French Revolution, more or less. Here you see this area which is already industrialized and urbanized. And this industrial area, which goes from England to Italy and to the southern part of what's now Poland, or still Germany, very much reflects, because it started like that and moved into Eastern and Southern Europe,